Millionaire helps woman in labor at restaurant, but his past changes everything. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. We continue. The rain was mercilessly lashing the streets of downtown Boston that Thursday afternoon. The Sunflower Restaurant, a traditional establishment frequented by the business elite of the area, maintained its welcoming and sophisticated atmosphere, while executives sought refuge from the downpour for their business lunches. The aroma of risotto and fine seasonings filled the air, mixing with the murmur of conversations and the clinking of silverware against porcelain. Richard Morgan occupied his usual table by the window, absently observing the drops running down the glass. At 45, his imposing figure in the tailored Italian suit contrasted with his lost and melancholic gaze. Few knew that this man, considered one of the greatest entrepreneurs in the American real estate market, carried a secret that had been consuming him for 15 years. The waiter approached discreetly, serving more wine in his glass. Richard didn't even notice. His thoughts wandered to a past he desperately tried to bury. The memories of that night in the operating room still haunted him, the monitors beeping, the team in panic, and he, a promising young obstetrician, watching his dreams crumble along with the life he couldn't save. The restaurant's doorbell chimed, announcing the arrival of another customer. A young woman entered staggering, completely soaked. Her simple dress clinging to her body revealed an advanced pregnancy. Her black hair dripped onto the red carpet, while her frightened eyes scanned the environment in search of a place to hide. Maya, as they would discover later, had fled that morning from the Clara House shelter. The place that should have been her refuge had turned into a nightmare. Pregnant and alone, without family or friends, she had no choice but to escape, when she realized that her life and her babies were in danger due to negligence and mistreatment. The maitre d' hesitated upon seeing her, clearly uncomfortable with her presence in that refined environment. Before he could approach her, Maya found a discreet table in the most distant corner of the dining room. She sat down with difficulty, trying to make herself invisible under the white linen tablecloth. Richard remained absorbed in his reflections, ruminating on the decision he had made after that fateful night. Abandoning medicine was not just a professional choice, it represented fleeing from his true vocation. Taking over the family business in real estate had provided him with fortune and prestige, but did not fill the void he carried. The Sunflower Restaurant was not a random choice for his solitary lunches. There, years ago, he used to meet Beatrice Sanders, the patient he had lost. Their conversations about the future baby, the plans, the dreams. Everything had ended abruptly at that table by the window, which he religiously occupied as a form of penance. The rain intensified outside and thunder began to shake the windows. Maya curled up even more in her corner, feeling the first contractions. She tried to breathe deeply, controlling the panic that was beginning to dominate her. She couldn't draw attention, couldn't let them find her. The clock marked 2:37 p.m. when a sharp scream cut through the refined atmosphere of the restaurant. All eyes turned to the dark corner where Maya was. She had slipped from the chair, falling onto the cold floor with her hands clutching her belly. Her water had broken, and labor was beginning right there in the middle of the restaurant. Chaos quickly ensued. Waiters ran around disoriented. Customers rose in alarm. Some took out their phones to film the scene. The manager, in panic, shouted for help, asking if there was any doctor present. Richard remained paralyzed in his chair, feeling the blood freeze in his veins. Fate, ironic and relentless, presented him with a choice that could redefine his existence. Time seemed to have frozen as Richard fought against his own demons. Maya's screams echoed through the restaurant, mixing with the growing buzz of customers. An elderly lady tried to calm the young woman, while the manager desperately shouted for help on the phone. It was then that something within Richard awakened. Years of training and medical instinct emerged through the layers of fear and guilt. He rose abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. With firm steps, he crossed the dining room toward the woman. His voice, previously an internal whisper of doubt, sounded clear and authoritative. "I'm a doctor. Please make room." The announcement provoked a wave of collective relief. The customers stepped back, forming a respectful circle around the scene. Among them, a woman in a red blazer observed attentively, her analytical gaze recording every detail. Sophie Adams, an investigative journalist from Truth Portal, was there for a story about corruption in the real estate sector. Fate was presenting her with a completely different story. Richard knelt beside Maya, trying to control the trembling in his hands. 15 years had passed since the last time he had delivered a baby. The memories of that tragic night threatened to paralyze his movements, but the critical state of the patient demanded immediate action. "What's your name?" he asked, while quickly assessing the situation. Maya, she responded between contractions. "Maya, I'm Dr. Morgan. I'm going to help you, okay? I need you to trust me." The young woman nodded, clutching his hand with surprising strength. Richard began to give precise orders. He asked for clean towels, hot water, hand sanitizer from the bathroom. He improvised a stretcher with tables, pushed together, covered by the restaurant's linen tablecloths. The manager, regaining his composure, coordinated the team to meet each request. Sophie continued observing. Her professional interest piqued by the way that man in the Italian suit was handling the situation. There was something familiar about his name, his gestures. Her journalistic intuition told her there was more to this story than a simple act of heroism. The labor was progressing rapidly, perhaps too quickly. Richard noticed that something wasn't right when he saw the bluish coloration on the lips of the baby that was beginning to appear. The umbilical cord was wrapped around the child's neck. A moment of hesitation crossed his face, and for an instant, the memories of Beatrice threatened to overwhelm him. "Doctor?" Maya's frightened voice brought him back to reality. "Everything's fine," he lied, keeping his voice steady. "But I need you to do exactly what I tell you." With precise movements, Richard began the maneuver to unwrap the cord. Each second seemed like an eternity. Sweat dripped from his forehead, staining his Italian suit. The people around held their breath, some filming with their cell phones, others praying silently. Sophie had taken out her recorder, capturing every moment. Her attention was caught by something Richard mumbled during the procedure. "Not this time, Beatrice." The name caused a shudder in her body. Beatrice, her older sister, whom she had lost during a failed delivery years ago. Finally, with a skillful movement, Richard freed the cord. The strong, healthy cry of the baby broke the tension in the room. Spontaneous applause erupted throughout the restaurant. Maya cried with relief and gratitude, while Richard wrapped the newborn in clean towels. "It's a girl," he announced, his voice choked with emotion. "A strong, healthy girl." The ambulance sirens finally arrived, breaking the magical moment. The paramedics took over the care of mother and daughter, while Richard discreetly stepped away. His hands were still trembling, but something had changed. The feeling of powerlessness that had haunted him for 15 years was beginning to dissipate. Sophie remained in the restaurant long after the ambulance departed. Seated at the same table Richard had occupied, her fingers drummed restlessly on her laptop as she searched frantically. His name, associated with medicine and Beatrice, had awakened painful memories that she had tried to bury for years. The computer screen illuminated her concentrated face as she scoured old newspaper archives. The search began to reveal intriguing results. Richard Morgan, one of the most promising obstetricians in Boston, had disappeared from the medical scene 15 years ago, exactly after an incident at St. Luke's Hospital. "It can't be a coincidence," she murmured to herself, noting every detail in her notebook. The dates perfectly coincided with the time when Beatrice, her sister, had passed away during a complicated delivery. Sophie had always suspected there was more to the story than she had been told, but her attempts at investigation had hit closed doors and convenient silences. Meanwhile, at Central Hospital, Richard remained seated in the waiting room, still, wearing his stained suit. He couldn't leave without making sure Maya and the baby were okay. The nurses cast curious glances in his direction, whispering about the millionaire doctor who had performed a delivery in the middle of a restaurant. His thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice. "So it's true. You've come back." Dr. Albert. Turner, his former mentor, was standing in front of him. Time had painted his hair white, but his eyes maintained the same keen sparkle from years ago. Richard felt the weight of 15 years of absence in that unexpected encounter. "I haven't come back, Albert. It was just an emergency. An emergency that brought you back to your true essence." The older doctor sat beside him. "I heard what happened at the restaurant. The paramedics said it was an impeccable procedure." Richard looked away, unable to accept the compliment. It was luck. It could have gone wrong. Like that time. "You still blame yourself for what happened with Beatrice Sanders?" Albert asked softly. "Richard, you were the best resident I ever had. What happened that night wasn't your fault. I should have noticed the signs earlier. I should have acted faster. And today, why didn't you run when you saw that young woman needing help?" The question hit Richard like a punch. Indeed, why hadn't he simply ignored the situation? He had everything to do so: money, influence, a completely different life. But something inside him, something he thought had died long ago, had awakened. The moment he heard Maya's scream. On the other side of the city, Sophie arrived at the Truth Portal building. Her desk was cluttered with old files and newspaper clippings. On the wall, a frame with her first award-winning major report, an investigation into medical negligence in public hospitals. "Sophie, I thought you were investigating the real estate scheme," commented Peter, her editor, approaching with a cup of coffee. "I was, but I found something bigger," she replied without taking her eyes off the screen. "Remember my sister's story? I think I finally discovered who was the doctor responsible for the shift that night." Peter frowned, concerned. "Sophie, it's been 15 years. Are you sure you want to reopen that wound?" "It's not about reopening wounds, Peter. It's about finding the truth." She opened a new page in the browser, showing old photos of Richard in his days as a doctor, alongside headlines about his current fortune in the real estate market. This man abandoned medicine after an incident and transformed himself into one of the biggest businessmen in the country. But today, he resurfaced out of nowhere to save a mother and a baby in the middle of a restaurant. Why would someone do that after so long? "What's the angle of your story?" Sophie hesitated for a moment. "I don't know yet, but there's something in this story. Something that needs to be told." Back at the hospital, Richard finally received news about Maya and the baby. Both were doing well, but the doctors had discovered that the young woman had fled from a shelter. Social workers were already on their way to assess the situation. "Dr. Morgan," a nurse called him, "the patient is asking for you. She wants to thank you personally." Richard felt his heart race. Entering that room meant more than a simple thank. Yet it meant facing all the ghosts that had haunted him for 15 years. Dr. Albert, who had remained by his side, placed a hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes, Richard, fate gives us a second chance not to erase the past, but to learn from it." The hospital room was silent, except for the soft beep of the heart monitor. Maya, still pale but with a serene smile, held the tiny baby in her arms. When Richard entered, her eyes filled with tears of gratitude. "Doctor, I don't even know how to thank you," she began, but her voice failed with emotion. Richard approached hesitantly, observing the scene with a mixture of joy and apprehension. The newborn slept peacefully, her tiny fingers clutching the hospital blanket. The image was so similar to that night 15 years ago, but the outcome, thank heavens, had been completely different. "No need to thank me," he replied softly. "How are you both doing?" "Well, thanks to you." Maya adjusted herself in the bed. "The doctors said that if it hadn't been for your quickness, if it had taken a few more minutes." She didn't complete the sentence, but the meaning hung heavily in the air. Richard swallowed hard, fighting against the memories that threatened to overwhelm him. "The important thing is that everything is fine now. I wanted you to know I've chosen her name." Maya smiled, looking at her daughter. "I'm going to call her Marina Morgan." The surprise made Richard take a step back. "Morgan?" "Yes. I want her to carry the name of the man who saved us, if you allow it, of course." Before Richard could respond, a commotion at the door caught his attention. Two social workers entered the room, accompanied by a woman he immediately recognized, Sophie Adams. "Mr. Morgan," Sophie stepped forward, her professional tone barely disguising the tension in her voice. "Could I have a few minutes of your time?" Richard cast a final glance at Maya and the baby before following Sophie into the hallway. His heart pounded in his chest. There was something in the journalist's gaze that made him uneasy. 15 years ago, Sophie began without preamble, you were the doctor on duty at St. Luke's Hospital when a patient named Beatrice Sanders went into labor. The blood froze in Richard's veins. There it was finally, his past coming to collect its debt. "How do you know about that?" "Beatrice was my sister," Sophie revealed, her voice trembling slightly. "All these years, I've tried to understand what happened that night. Why the most promising doctor at the hospital simply disappeared afterward. Why no one ever gave me clear answers." Richard leaned against the wall, feeling the weight of 15 years of guilt threatening to crush him. I did everything I could." "I'm not here to accuse you," Sophie interrupted him. "Not anymore. Seeing what you did today, how you saved that young woman and her baby, that changed something in me." In the room next door, the social workers were talking with Maya. The young woman, between tears, recounted the abuses suffered at the Clara House shelter. Sophie, who was listening to the conversation, made quick notes in her notebook. "Mr. Morgan," she continued, "I'm investigating a series of complaints against city shelters. Maya's case is not isolated, but I need to understand. I need to know the truth about what happened to my sister to be able to move forward." Richard closed his eyes, breathing deeply. When he opened them again, there was a new determination in his gaze. "Come with me," he said. "I'll show you something." Together they walked to the administrative wing of the hospital. Richard requested access to the old files, using his old credential, which surprisingly still worked. In a dusty room, he located the folder he was looking for. "Here is Beatrice's complete medical record," he handed the file to Sophie, "including my detailed reports on what happened. There was never any negligence, Sophie. Your sister had an undiagnosed heart condition that worsened during delivery. We did everything possible, but..." Sophie leafed through the documents with trembling hands, years of doubts finally finding answers. "Why did you never tell us this? Why did you run away?" "Because I blame myself. I thought I should have noticed the signs earlier, that I should have ordered more tests. The guilt consumed me so much that I couldn't practice medicine anymore, so I ran. I buried myself in the family business, trying to forget who I was. Until today," Sophie completed softly. "Until Maya." The silence that followed was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps in the corridor. A nurse appeared, breathless. "Dr. Morgan, the baby, she needs you." Richard and Sophie ran down the hospital corridor, the echo of their footsteps mixing with the sound of monitors and agitated voices. When they reached the room, they found little Marina with breathing difficulties, while Maya watched in panic, being restrained by nurses. Richard's medical instinct took control immediately. His hands, previously hesitant with memories of the past, now moved with precision and confidence. He quickly examined the newborn, identifying signs of respiratory distress. "I need a suction device and oxygen," he ordered, his firm voice echoing through the room. The nursing team responded promptly, bringing the requested equipment. Sophie observed the scene, her journalistic instinct momentarily forgotten in the face of the urgency of the moment. She saw in Richard not the man she had suspected for years, but a dedicated professional, fighting to save a life. Exactly as he had done with her sister Beatrice, she now understood. "It's a small amount of amniotic fluid in the lungs," Richard explained as he worked, both to calm Maya and to guide the team. "It sometimes happens in rapid deliveries like hers. We'll fix this." With precise and delicate movements, he performed the aspiration, constantly monitoring the baby's vital signs. Gradually, Marina's breathing normalized, her strong cry filling the room, a sound that for everyone present represented the sweetest music. "She'll be fine," he finally announced, allowing himself a smile of relief. "But we'll keep her under Observation for 24 hours. Just as a precaution. Maya cried silently, her hands clasped in prayer. The social workers, who had remained in the room throughout the emergency, exchanged significant looks. "Dr. Morgan," one of them approached. "We need to discuss Ms. Maya's situation. She reported very concerning conditions at Clara House Shelter, but now she has nowhere to go." Richard looked at Sophie, who was already taking notes in her notebook. The journalist raised her eyes, an idea forming in her mind. "Maybe we can help with that," she said, approaching. "I have contacts who can offer temporary protection while we investigate the complaints against the shelter." "No," Richard interrupted, surprising everyone. "She can stay at my place. I have a guest apartment in the same building where I live, fully furnished and never used. She'll be safe there." The offer caught everyone by surprise, especially Sophie. It was as if the man before her was transforming before her eyes, or perhaps she thought he was just returning to who he had always been. "Mr. Morgan," one of the social workers began, hesitant, "your offer is very generous, but there are procedures which can be followed while she is settled in a safe place," he completed, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I am a respectable citizen, with resources to ensure her and the child's well-being. And more importantly, I am a doctor, even if I haven't practiced in recent years. I can monitor the health of both." Sophie observed the interaction with growing interest. The story was taking a turn she hadn't expected. Her initial investigation into Richard's past was transforming into something much bigger, a story of redemption, second chances, and above all, humanity. "If I may," she intervened, "I can help with the necessary documentation. I have experience in similar cases and contacts in the district attorney's office who can expedite the process." Maya, who until then had only been listening, found her voice. "Please, let me accept Dr. Morgan's offer. He saved my life and my daughter's. I trust him." The simple and sincere words of the young mother seemed to seal the decision. The social workers, after some phone consultations and verification of Richard's documents, agreed to start the procedures for temporary guardianship. While the details were being worked out, Dr. Albert Turner observed everything from the doorway, a satisfied smile on his experienced face. He approached Richard, who was still monitoring Marina's vital signs. "You know, my friend," he said quietly, "sometimes fate forces us to face our fears, not to punish us, but to show us that the fear was smaller than we thought." Richard nodded silently, his eyes fixed on little Marina, who now slept peacefully. On the other side of the room, Sophie was making calls, organizing the logistics of the transfer, and at the same time beginning to structure in her mind the story she needed to tell. The luxurious building in Beacon Hill where Richard lived never seemed so alive as on that night. The guest apartment, a 1,600 square foot space that had always remained empty, was rapidly transforming into a welcoming home for Maya and Marina. Sophie had activated her network of contacts, getting donations of clothes, diapers, and everything necessary for a newborn baby. The mobilization had been surprising. Journalist colleagues, hospital nurses, and even the social workers contributed, creating a veritable emergency layette. "I never imagined I would be doing this," Richard commented, as he helped organize the baby's room. His hands, accustomed to signing million-dollar contracts, now assembled a crib with surprising skill. Sophie, who was coordinating the organization of the space, paused for a moment to observe him. "People can surprise us, can't they? Including ourselves." The comment carried a special weight. In the last 48 hours, both had been forced to reevaluate years of convictions and resentments. The journalist who sought revenge and the doctor fleeing from his past discovered together a new purpose. "I need to show you something," Richard said, finishing adjusting the last screw of the crib. "Come with me." He led Sophie to his office, in the main apartment. The room, with its walls covered in dark wood and panoramic view of the city, reflected the success of the businessman he had become. But it was to a small locked drawer that he directed himself. "During all these years," he explained as he searched for the key, "I kept a diary. I started writing on the night I lost Beatrice, your sister. It was my way of dealing with the guilt, of trying to understand what happened. Sophie felt her heart race when Richard handed her the black-covered notebook, worn by time. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because you deserve to know the whole truth. Not just the medical facts that were in the record, but what happened to me afterward, how that night changed my life and how it may have prepared me for today." While Sophie began to read, in the apartment next door, Maya cradled Marina, softly singing a lullaby. The young woman could hardly believe the turnaround her life had taken in less than 2 days. From desperation on the streets to the safety of a home, her story seemed like a modern fairy tale. Sophie's phone vibrated. It was Peter, her editor. "Sophie, where's the article on the real estate developers? The deadline was today." "Peter, I have a much bigger story," she replied, her eyes still fixed on the diary. "It's about second chances, redemption, and how fate sometimes chooses surprising paths to heal old wounds." "What are you talking about?" "Remember when you told me that some stories need time to be told? This is one of them. I need a few more days." In the corridor between the 2 apartments, Dr. Albert Turner arrived for a visit. He brought with him an old folder, yellowed by time. "Richard," he called after being received, "I found something you need to see. These are the complete records of Beatrice's case, including tests that arrived afterward. Tests you never saw because you had already left." Richard's heart froze. "What? Tests? Those that prove you were right from the beginning. Your suspicion about her heart condition, you had ordered the specific tests weeks before, but the laboratory was delayed. The condition was congenital, Richard. There was nothing any doctor could have done." Sophie, who followed the conversation while reading the diary, felt silent tears running down her face. Years of misdirected anger, of searching for someone to blame, crumbled before a truth that, paradoxically, brought more peace than vengeance. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice choked. Richard looked out the window, observing the city that stretched beneath the night sky. In the apartment next door, Marina's soft crying could be heard, soon soothed by Maya's sweet voice. "I'll maintain American character names and settings, keeping the original narrative flow and length." A week passed since Maya and Marina settled in the guest apartment. The routine in the luxurious building had completely transformed. The security guards had already grown accustomed to Sophie's frequent visits, who divided her time between investigating Clara House Shelter and writing her new report. That Sunday morning, Richard was having coffee on the balcony when he heard soft knocks on his door. It was Maya with Marina in her arms. "Dr. Morgan," she began, hesitant, "may I talk to you?" Richard indicated the chair beside him, noticing the worried expression on the young woman's face. "Of course, and please, call me Richard." "It's about the shelter." Maya adjusted Marina in her lap, the baby sleeping serenely. "Sophie told me they're trying to locate me. They say I left without authorization, that they might take legal action." The concern in her voice was palpable. Richard felt a wave of protection take over him. "Don't worry. We already have the social workers on our side, and Sophie is gathering evidence about the irregularities at the place." "It's not just that," Maya continued, her voice trembling slightly. "There are other girls there, other pregnant women. What's happening to them? Now I can't stop thinking." At this moment, the elevator to the floor opened, revealing Sophie accompanied by an elegant grey-haired lady. Richard rose abruptly, recognizing her immediately. Helen Sanders, Beatrice's mother. "Richard!" Sophie stepped forward, noticing his shock. "I met Mrs. Sanders by chance at church this morning. She wants to talk to you." Time seemed to freeze. Maya, sensing the tension in the air, discreetly stood up to return to her apartment, but Helen stopped her with a gentle gesture. "Please, stay," the lady requested. "What I have to say concerns everyone here." Helen sat down, her eyes scanning the face of each person present before settling on Richard. 15 years is a long time to carry a guilt that isn't yours, my son." Richard felt his legs weaken. In all his nightmares about that night, he had never imagined that one day he would face the gaze of Beatrice's mother. "Mrs. Sanders, Let me speak," she interrupted him gently. "Sophie showed me the tests, told me about your initial suspicion. about Beatrice's heart condition. Do you know what else she showed me? Your diary, the pages and pages of guilt you've carried all these years. Helen paused, her hands trembling slightly as she took something from her purse, an old photo. In it, Beatrice smiled, pregnant, sitting in exactly that restaurant where everything had begun. My daughter trusted you, Richard. She always said you were different from other doctors, that you truly cared. And you know what? She was right. Sophie, who was observing the scene, noticed silent tears running down Richard's face. Maya hugged Marina tighter, as if the little one were a talisman against the pain that hung in the air. I came here today, Helen continued, because I finally understood that I wasn't the only one who lost someone that night. You lost your vocation, your confidence, part of your soul. And now, seeing how you saved this young woman and her baby, how you're protecting them, I know my daughter would smile to see the doctor you've become again. The silence that followed was broken, only by Marina's soft snoring. Richard stared fixedly at the photo in his hands, memories of conversations with Beatrice in that same restaurant flooding his mind. There's something else, Helen said, turning to Sophie. I found some of Beatrice's diaries in the attic. She also suspected her condition. She had symptoms that she hid from everyone, even from you, Richard. She thought she could handle everything on her own. Sophie felt her heart tighten. Her sister, always so independent, so strong, now she better understood why Beatrice sometimes seemed so distant in her last months. And what about the shelter? Maya asked softly, surprising everyone. How can we help the other girls who are still there? Helen smiled, a determined gleam in her eyes. Perhaps it's time to transform our pain into something greater, something that can really make a difference. The meeting in Richard's penthouse extended throughout the entire afternoon. Sophie had brought all her investigative material on Clara House Shelter. Anonymous testimonies, photos of precarious facilities, suspicious financial documents. Helen, with her experience as a former child welfare counselor, analyzed each piece of evidence with expert eyes. The problem is bigger than we imagined, Sophie explained, spreading documents on the coffee table. The shelter receives public funds, but there's no proper accountability. The pregnant women are treated like prisoners, without adequate access to prenatal care. Richard, who until then had been observing in silence, rose abruptly. I have an idea, he said, heading to his office. He returned minutes later with architectural plans and real estate documents. This is a property I bought 2 years ago, intending to build a business center, he explained, spreading the plans on the table. It's located 10 minutes from Central Hospital in a quiet residential area. Maya, who was cradling the sleeping Marina, approached to see better. It's huge. And perfect for what I have in mind, Richard continued, a new gleam in his eyes. Instead of another commercial building, we can transform it into a shelter, center for pregnant women in vulnerable situations, with specialized medical care, psychological support, vocational courses. Helen took the plans, studying them with interest. It would be a way to honor Beatrice's memory, she said softly. She always worried about pregnant women who didn't have access to proper care. Sophie was furiously taking notes in her notebook. I can use my report to give visibility to the project, show how a personal tragedy can be transformed into something that benefits the entire community. But what about Clara House Shelter? Maya asked, the concern evident in her voice. The girls who are still there. That's where I come in. Dr. Albert, who had arrived during the discussion, spoke up. I have contacts at the medical board and the district attorney's office. With the evidence Sophie has collected, we can push for an official investigation. Richard walked to the window, watching the sun set over the city. 15 years earlier, on that fateful night, he had fled from his vocation, burying himself in numbers and business. Now the universe presented him with a chance for redemption, greater than he had ever imagined. I'll need help from all of you, he said, turning to the group. Helen, your experience with social assistance will be fundamental. Sophie, we'll need the power of the media to bring transparency to the process. Dr. Albert, your institutional contacts will be essential. Maya, who had remained quieter until then, raised her voice. And I can help by telling my story, showing why places like this are so necessary. Marina chose that moment to wake up, her soft cry echoing through the apartment. As if it were a sign, everyone smiled. "I think she approves too," Helen commented affectionately. Richard picked up his phone, making a quick call. "Carlos, I need you to cancel all my appointments for next week. Yes, including the meeting with the Chinese investors. We have a new priority project." Sophie observed the scene with a mixture of admiration and hope. Her search for justice had transformed into something much bigger. In her notebook, she began to write the provisional title of her report, "From Shadows to Light: How Pain Transforms into Hope." "Richard," called Dr. Albert, "you know this means returning to medicine, don't you? We can't do this without a competent medical director." A serene smile appeared on Richard's face. "Yes, I know, and for the first time in 15 years, I don't feel afraid of that idea." Helen approached him, holding his hands between hers. "Beatrice would be proud, not just about the project, but to see you finally forgiving yourself." The group continued planning until late into the night, outlining the first steps of what would be a true revolution in care for vulnerable pregnant women. In Maya's lap, Marina slept peacefully, oblivious to the fact that her arrival in the world had triggered a transformation much greater than anyone could have imagined. Sophie's article exploded on social media the following morning. The title, "From Shadows to Light: The Story Behind the Restaurant Delivery," occupied the front page of Truth Portal, accompanied by a photo of Richard in his days as a doctor, side by side with a current image of him carrying Marina at the hospital. The text was masterful, balancing sensitivity and denunciation. Sophie had managed to intertwine three stories: Beatrice's tragedy, Maya's rescue, and Richard's transformation. The allegations against Clara House Shelter occupied a special section, supported by anonymous testimonies and incriminating documents. "This is going to cause a tsunami," Peter, the editor, warned when the article went live. "We're already receiving dozens of calls. Other media outlets want interviews. Politicians are making statements." Sophie observed the movement in the newsroom with a mixture of pride and apprehension. "And the people from the shelter? Any reaction?" "They tried to get an injunction to prevent publication, but they couldn't. Our legal department ensured that everything is well documented." In Richard's apartment, the atmosphere was equally tense. His phone wouldn't stop ringing, with calls from partners, journalists, and even former colleagues from the hospital. Maya and Marina had been temporarily transferred to a flat at another address, protected by private security. "The medical board wants to make a statement," Dr. Albert informed, entering the apartment with several newspapers under his arm. "They're divided. Some claim you practice medicine illegally at the restaurant. Others argue it was an emergency situation." Richard absently leafed through the newspapers, his tired face reflecting sleepless nights. "And what about the shelter center project?" "The reactions are surprisingly positive. I've already received 5 calls from colleagues wanting to volunteer. Helen is in a meeting with representatives from social services. It seems they want to establish a partnership." Richard's phone rang again. It was Sophie. "Richard, we need to talk. There are complications." Half an hour later, Sophie arrived at the apartment, accompanied by Helen. The journalist seemed nervous, something rare in her usually confident demeanor. "I received an anonymous call," she began, placing a flash drive on the table. "Someone from the shelter leaked information about a much larger scheme. It's not just negligence. There's an organized scheme of misappropriation of public resources involving powerful people." Helen sat heavily on the sofa. "And there's more. Some of the girls who passed through the shelters, their stories are terrible. Psychological manipulation, forged documents." "What do we do now?" Richard asked, his voice betraying his concern. "We continue," Sophie responded firmly. "But we need to be even more careful. The people involved are influential. They have political connections." Dr. Albert, who had been listening to everything in silence, spoke up. "Maybe it's time to accelerate our plans. The faster we establish the shelter center, the harder it will be for them to retaliate." Richard walked to his desk, picking up a folder of documents. "I've already arranged the transfer of the property to a non-profit foundation. The architectural project is ready. We can start construction in 2 weeks." "And what about Maya?" Helen asked. "Is she safe?" "I've installed her and Marina in a protected place," Richard assured, "but she's restless. She wants to participate more actively in the project, wants to help other women who went through what she experienced." Sophie smiled despite the tension. "She's stronger than we imagined. All of them are." A knock on the doorbell interrupted the conversation. It was Carlos, Richard's assistant, with a worried expression on his face. "Dr. Morgan, the real estate. Board is demanding an emergency meeting. They're threatening a vote of no confidence." Richard exchanged glances with those present. His business empire, built over 15 years, was at risk. But for the first time, that didn't seem so important. "Schedule the meeting," he responded calmly. "Fence time they understand that some things are more important than money." Sophie made some notes in her notebook. "I'll need a statement from you, Richard. The public needs to understand why one of the country's biggest businessmen is risking everything for this cause." "I'm not risking everything," he gently corrected. "I'm finally recovering who I really am." "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his firm voice echoing through the room, "I know many of you have doubts about my recent decisions. Some even question my leadership ability." Slides began to be projected behind him. They weren't financial charts or market projections, but images of the shelter center project. "What you see is more than a social project. It's a revolution in how we treat our most vulnerable pregnant women. And yes, I'm willing to invest a considerable portion of my personal resources in this." One of the oldest board members stood up. "Richard, no one questions the nobility of the cause. But you're mixing personal issues with business. This could affect share value, investor confidence." "On the contrary," Sophie intervened, distributing folders to those present. "Studies show that companies with strong social commitments perform better in the long term. The media is already positively covering the initiative." Helen stepped forward, her elegant presence capturing the room's attention. "As a former child welfare counselor and a mother, I can guarantee this project is not just about charity. It's about transforming lives and creating a lasting legacy." The debate extended for hours. In the end, a vote was proposed. 72% of the board members supported Richard's continuation as president, with the condition that the shelter center project be kept separate from the real estate firm's operations. Leaving the meeting, Richard found Maya waiting in the building's lobby, with Marina sleeping peacefully in her stroller. "You shouldn't be here," he warned, concerned. "It's still not safe." "I needed to see with my own eyes," she replied. "Sophie told me you would risk your position for our cause. I wanted to be present to thank you, regardless of the outcome." Dr. Albert smiled, observing the scene. "You know, Richard, in 30 years of medicine, I've learned that sometimes we need our patients as much as they need us." The next day, the construction site of the future Beatrice Sanders Shelter Center began to come to life. Engineers, architects, and workers worked at an accelerated pace. The project, developed with contributions from maternal and child health specialists, envisioned welcoming spaces, modern consulting rooms, and communal areas. Sophie continued her investigation, now with support from a special team from the district attorney's office. Each new discovery about the scheme at Clara House Shelter reinforced the importance of the work they were developing. "Look at this," she showed Richard, a stack of new testimonies. 5 more women have come forward after the article. Their stories are very similar to Maya's. Richard was examining the documents when his phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Dr. Morgan?" A female voice, hesitant. "My name is Claire. I was a nurse at St. Luke's Hospital. I was on duty that night, the night of Beatrice." Richard's heart raced. Claire had been one of the most dedicated nurses on his team. "I never forgave myself for not speaking up earlier," she continued, her voice choked. "But after reading Sophie's article, after seeing what you're doing now, I need to tell you something important about that night." Helen, who was following the conversation, held Richard's hand in silent support. Dr. Albert approached, recognizing the gravity of the moment. "Claire," Richard replied softly, "whatever it is, I'm ready to listen." The sound of Marina's cry echoed through the corridor. It was time for her bottle. Maya appeared at the office door, cradling the little one. "Sorry to interrupt," she said quietly. Richard looked at the group gathered there. Sophie with her documents, Helen with her maternal support, Dr. Albert with his wisdom, Maya with her strength, and Marina, the small miracle who had catalyzed all that transformation. "Don't worry," he replied, a serene smile on his face. "We're all exactly where we should be." Claire arrived at Richard's office that same afternoon, her hands trembling. As she held an old yellowed folder, her eyes revealed the weight of a secret carried for 15 years. Sophie, with her keen journalistic instinct, immediately perceived that this meeting would change the course of the entire story. "I kept this all these years," Claire began, carefully opening the folder. "These are the complete records of that night, including notes that no one else saw." Richard sat heavily in his chair, while Helen and Dr. Albert approached. Maya, who had just put Marina down for a nap, quietly joined the group. "Beatrice had a family history of heart problems," Claire continued, her voice gaining firmness. "But there was something more. On the day of the delivery, before you arrived for your shift, Richard, she confided in me that she had been feeling symptoms for weeks but hid them from everyone, including you." Sophie took her notebook, starting to make frantic notes. Helen brought her hands to her face, painful memories of her daughter coming back. "She was afraid," Claire explained, tears in her eyes. "Afraid they would postpone the delivery. Afraid she wouldn't be able to have her baby. So when the contractions started, she minimized the symptoms, said everything was fine." Richard leafed through the documents with trembling hands. Among the pages, he found a letter written by Beatrice herself, dated the day before the delivery. "If something happens to me," he read aloud, "I want you to know it was my choice. Dr. Morgan was always careful, always insisted on the tests, but I chose not to listen." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of Marina's cry. Maya quickly went to soothe the baby, returning moments later with the little one in her arms. "There's more," Claire continued, removing a sealed envelope from the folder. "Beatrice left this for you, Richard. She asked me to deliver it if something happened. But when you disappeared, when everything fell apart, I didn't have the courage." With trembling hands, Richard opened the envelope. Beatrice's delicate handwriting filled the page. "Dear Richard, if you are reading this, it means my choices had consequences I can no longer face. I want you to know that you were more than my doctor. You were my guardian angel, who tried to protect me even from myself. Don't carry guilt for my decisions. Use your gift to continue saving lives, to make the difference you always dreamed of making. With affection, Beatrice." Helen sobbed silently, supported by Sophie. Dr. Albert placed a hand on Richard's shoulder, who remained in shock, rereading the letter repeatedly. "Why did you decide to reveal this now?" Sophie gently asked Claire. "Because I saw in your article what Richard is doing. The shelter center, the way he saved Maya and Marina. He deserves to know the truth. Deserves to be freed from this guilt he's carried unjustly for so long." Maya approached Richard, Marina asleep in her arms. Maybe that's why our paths crossed, so you could finally find peace. And so Beatrice's legacy could continue. Through the shelter center," Helen completed, wiping away tears. Richard stood up, walking to the window. The shelter center construction site was visible in the distance, the cranes silhouetted against the evening sky. "For 15 years, he finally spoke, I woke up every morning wondering what I could have done differently. Now I understand that the question wasn't what I did that night, but what I'll do from now on." Sophie closed her notebook, a new perspective forming in her mind. This is no longer just a story about redemption. It's about how truth, no matter how long it takes, has the power to heal. Claire stood up, preparing to leave. "There's one more thing you need to know. At the shelter, there are documents that prove that the same group that diverted resources also pressured women to hide health problems, to avoid spending on specialized exams and procedures." The group exchanged alarmed glances. The story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning a new phase. Claire's revelation about the practices at Clara House Shelter triggered a chain reaction. Sophie spent the entire night in the newsroom, working on a new series of reports. The district attorney's office, which was already investigating the case, intensified its actions after the new evidence. The next morning, Richard gathered his team of lawyers. It was no longer just about building a new shelter center. It was about dismantling a system that put the lives of vulnerable women at risk. "We need to act quickly," he instructed. "I want all the documents, all the evidence. We can gather about the shelter's practices, and I want legal protection for all women who decide to testify." Helen, using her contacts in social services, began to locate other former residents of the shelter. Each new story confirmed the pattern of negligence and manipulation. Maya, still protected in the flat, became a support point for these women, listening to their stories and offering comfort. "It's amazing how they trust you," Sophie commented, observing Maya consoling a young pregnant woman who had just left the shelter. "They need to know they're not alone," Maya replied, adjusting Marina in her lap, "that there's hope that they can start over." Dr. Albert arrived with encouraging news from the medical board. The complaint about illegal practice of medicine was dismissed. More than that, they want your official return to the profession, Richard. They're offering a simplified revalidation process. Richard, who was examining the shelter center plans with a group of architects, raised his eyes, surprised. "After so long, your story has inspired many people," Dr. Albert smiled. "Some of the best specialists in obstetrics in the country have offered to supervise your update." The shelter center construction was advancing rapidly. What was once just an empty lot was transforming into a modern and welcoming complex. Helen personally supervised every detail, ensuring that the space reflected not just functionality, but also welcome and dignity. "Beatrice would have loved this," she commented, showing Sophie the project for the communal area. "She always said hospitals needed more life, more color." Late that afternoon, an unexpected meeting again changed the course of events. One of the shelter's counselors, unable to bear the weight on her conscience any longer, sought Sophie with a bombshell revelation. "It's not just the resources they divert," she explained, trembling. "There's a much bigger scheme. Some of the women who passed through the shelter, their babies were sent for adoption without proper consent." The news hit the group like lightning. Richard immediately called an emergency meeting in his apartment. Sophie, Helen, Dr. Albert, Maya, and... Now Claire formed a kind of informal council, each contributing with their experience and perspective. "This explains why some women simply disappeared from the shelter," Maya commented, recalling her days there. "They said they had been transferred, but we never heard from them again." "We need to act very carefully," Sophie warned. "The people involved are powerful, have political connections. If we're going to expose this, we need to be sure we can protect the victims." Richard observed the group discussing strategies, feeling a mixture of pride and determination. The universe had conspired in a mysterious way to bring all those people together, each with their pain and hopes, transforming a personal tragedy into a collective mission of change. "Do you know what Beatrice wrote in her last letter?" he shared, his voice soft but firm. "Use your gift to continue saving lives." I think I finally understand what she meant. It's not just about deliveries and medical procedures. It's about saving people from systems that oppress them, from situations that make them vulnerable. Helen wiped a discreet tear. "And that's exactly what we're doing, isn't it? Transforming pain into purpose, fear into hope." "The calls won't stop," Peter informed Sophie as she organized a mountain of documents on her desk. "More women are coming forward, some from other states. It seems the scheme is much bigger than we imagined." Downtown, the law firm hired by Richard worked at a frantic pace. Dozens of cases were being prepared, each meticulously documenting the shelter's irregularities. "We found a pattern," explained Dr. Marcia, the lawyer in charge of the case. "They specifically targeted women in situations of extreme vulnerability, without family or social support. They manipulated documents, forged signatures." Helen, who was participating in the meeting, felt her heart tighten. "How many babies?" "So far, we've identified 47 confirmed cases in the last 3 years, but we suspect the real number is much higher." Maya, who followed everything closely while breastfeeding Marina, couldn't contain her tears. It could have been me. I could have lost my daughter. Richard placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. But you didn't. And now we're fighting so no other mother goes through this. The construction site of the Beatrice Sanders Shelter Center had transformed into a symbol of hope. Every day, people showed up offering help. Volunteer doctors, psychologists, social workers. The community mobilized in a surprising way. Dr. Albert coordinated the medical team formation while supervising Richard's license revalidation process. "You know what's most impressive?" he commented during a break. "How all this started with a seemingly casual encounter in a restaurant." Claire, who now officially integrated the center's team, organized the care protocols based on her vast experience. "Every detail matters," she explained to the volunteers, "from how we receive these women to how we document their stories." One afternoon, while Richard reviewed old medical records as part of his professional update, he received an unexpected visit. It was a middle-aged couple, clearly nervous. "Dr. Morgan," the man began, hesitant. "Our daughter, she was at Clara House Shelter 2 years ago. They told us she had given up the baby, that she had signed the adoption papers. But after reading the report, Sophie, who was present, immediately took out her recorder. Another story was coming to light, another family destroyed by the scheme they were now fighting to dismantle. Helen took on the role of welcoming the couple, her experience as a child welfare counselor proving invaluable. "We'll help you find your daughter," she promised, her voice conveying a certainty that came from the soul. At the end of that day, the group gathered in Richard's apartment, as had become customary. Marina played with a colorful mobile, her laughter bringing lightness to a moment of deep reflection. "Sometimes I wonder," Maya commented, watching her daughter, "how so much evil can exist in the world. How people can do this to mothers and babies. That's why we need to continue," Richard replied, his gaze fixed on the horizon through the window. "Each story we discover, each family we help reunite, is a victory against this system." Sophie, who was furiously typing on her laptop, raised her eyes. "I just received important information. A former clerk from the registry office wants to talk. Says she has proof of how the documentation was falsified." The group exchanged determined looks. Each day, more pieces of the puzzle fit together, revealing the extent of the network of corruption and cruelty they had begun to dismantle. "You know what's amazing?" Dr. Albert reflected, breaking a moment of silence. "How the universe works in mysterious ways. The pain Richard carried for 15 years, Sophie's search for justice, Maya's courageous escape, all of this converged for this moment." Helen smiled, picking up Marina in her arms. "And this little one here, who came into the world in such a dramatic way, is living proof that there's always hope, always a new beginning possible." The following weeks were of intense work and impactful discoveries. The former registry office clerk, Mrs. Cecilia, brought with her a folder full of copies of documents that proved the falsification scheme. Each page revealed a new story of pain and separation. "I couldn't bear carrying this weight anymore," she explained to Sophie during a long interview. "Every time I saw a desperate mother looking for information about her baby, I felt like I was an accomplice to a terrible crime." Cecilia's testimony opened doors that previously seemed sealed. With her information, the legal team managed to map the destination of dozens of babies. The work of reuniting separated families had begun. "It's a delicate process," explained Dr. Marcia during a meeting in Richard's office. "Some of these children have been with adoptive families for years. We need to think about the emotional impact for everyone involved." Helen, with her experience, took on the coordination of psychological support for both the biological mothers and the adoptive families. "The important thing is not to create more trauma," she emphasized in her meetings with the team. "Each case needs to be treated with extreme sensitivity." Maya surprised everyone by volunteering to help welcome the mothers who came seeking information. With Marina always nearby, she became a living symbol of hope for those women. "When they see me with Marina, when I tell our story, something changes in their eyes," she commented to Richard. "It's as if they realize they're not alone, that there's a chance for a new beginning." The Beatrice Sanders Shelter Center was almost ready. The walls in soft tones, the gardens designed to convey tranquility, every detail had been thought to create an environment of healing and renewal. Beatrice always said hospitals needed more life, Helen commented during a visit to the construction. She would be proud to see how her dream has transformed into something even greater. Richard, who dedicated his mornings to the revalidation program and his afternoons to the center, felt increasingly closer to his true vocation. The fear that had paralyzed him for 15 years gave way to a serene determination. "It's different now," he explained to Dr. Albert during a break between classes. "Before, I was afraid of not being good enough, of failing again. Today, I understand that our greatest strength comes precisely from recognizing our humanity, our limitations." Sophie continued her series of reports, now focusing on stories of family reunification. Her work had transformed into a personal mission to give voice to those who for so long had been silenced. One afternoon, while the group met to review the week's progress, Claire brought exciting news. The first family had been reunited. Our mother, who had lost contact with her daughter 3 years ago, could finally embrace her again. "It was a magical moment," Claire described, "emotional." The adoptive family, when they learned the true story, decided to maintain contact, to allow the girl to know her origins. Maya, cradling the peacefully sleeping Marina, felt tears of joy running down her face. "Each baby we help reunite with their mother is a victory not only against the system that oppressed us, but also for our own healing." Richard observed the scene with a mixture of gratitude and determination. In his office, Beatrice's letter occupied a place of honor, framed next to Marina's first photo, taken on that chaotic day at the restaurant. "This is pure dynamite," Peter commented, examining the documents. "Are you sure you want to publish? These people have a lot of power." "That's exactly why we need to publish," Sophie responded, determined. "They've kept their secrets for too long." At the Beatrice Sanders Shelter Center, now in its final phase of completion, Richard was conducting a meeting with the medical team. The process of revalidating his license was almost complete, and he was already preparing to assume the clinical direction of the place. "Dr. Morgan," a nurse interrupted the meeting, distressed. "There's a young woman at reception. She escaped from the shelter this morning. She's pregnant and very frightened." Richard and Dr. Albert rushed to the reception, where they found a trembling young woman not much older than Maya. Her wide eyes, filled with fear, reminded them so much of that afternoon at the restaurant. "My name is Anna," she whispered, protective of her 6-month pregnant belly. "I saw the report. I knew what they did with the babies. I couldn't let them take mine." Helen, who was at the center organizing donations, immediately assumed the role of welcoming her. "You're safe now, dear. No one is going to separate you from your baby." Maya, who now officially worked as a support counselor for pregnant women, approached with Marina in her arms. "I escaped from there too, Anna. I know exactly how you're feeling." Anna's arrival provoked an immediate reaction from those responsible for the shelter. Late that afternoon, Richard received a threatening phone call. "You don't know who you're messing with, Dr. Morgan." The voice on the phone was cold, calculating. "I suggest you return the girl and forget this story. It would be a shame if something happened to your beautiful project." Richard kept his calm. Years of difficult negotiations had prepared him for moments like this. "I'm recording this call," he responded serenely, "and I'm sure the police and the press would be very interested in hearing it." Sophie, who was monitoring the situation, immediately activated her contacts at the district attorney's office. The explicit threat was the evidence they needed to accelerate the investigations. "They're desperate," observed Claire, who was helping organize Anna's documentation. "They know they're losing control." Dr. Albert, with his decades of experience in medicine, shook his head worriedly. "Desperate people make mistakes. We need to double our security." Night fell over the city, bringing with it a palpable tension. In Richard's apartment, the group gathered to discuss the next steps. Marina slept in the improvised crib in the office, oblivious to the gravity of the situation. "The article is ready," Sophie announced, showing her laptop. "With the new documents and Anna's testimony, there's no way to deny the authorities' involvement." "And what about her safety?" Maya asked, concerned about her new friend. "I've already taken care of it," Richard replied. "I've hired private security for the center and for everyone involved in the case. No one is alone in this fight." Helen, who was observing the city through the window, turned to the group with a determined look. "You know what Beatrice always said? Fear only has power over us when we stop acting. And isn't that exactly what we're doing?" Dr. Albert smiled, transforming fear into action, silence into voice. The group worked until late into the night, preparing for what was to come. Each one knew that the next day would mark a point of no return. The publication of Sophie's article, combined with the formal complaint to the district attorney's office, would initiate a cascade of events that would forever change the system. They had begun to dismantle. "It's funny," Maya commented, watching Marina sleep, "how everything started with a casual encounter on a rainy day." "Nothing is casual," Richard replied, his gaze lost in the city lights. "Each person in this room had a wound to heal, a mission to fulfill. The universe just brought us together at the right moment." Sophie's article exploded on social media at 6 in the morning. Network of corruption and influence peddling, the truth behind irregular adoptions, occupied the front page of Truth Portal, accompanied by extensive documentation that left no doubt about the involvement of authorities in the scheme. The impact was immediate. Even before the sun had fully risen, police vehicles surrounded Clara House Shelter. Search and seizure warrants were being executed at various addresses in the city. The House of Cards was beginning to collapse. At the Beatrice Sanders Shelter Center, the team was preparing for a historic day. It was the date of the official inauguration, coincidentally scheduled for the same day as the article's publication. "We couldn't have chosen a more symbolic moment," Helen commented, adjusting the inauguration banner. "As a system of oppression falls, a new hope is born." Richard, wearing his white coat for the first time in 15 years, felt a mixture of emotions as he observed the movement of people arriving. Doctors, nurses, social workers, all volunteers, all committed to the same cause. "How are you feeling?" Dr. Albert asked, noticing his contemplative expression. "At peace," Richard simply replied. "Finally, at peace." Maya arrived with Marina, both dressed specially for the occasion. The little one, now a few months old, smiled at everyone, enchanting. Those present with her contagious joy. "Look who's here," Claire exclaimed, approaching with Anna, who seemed stronger and more confident after weeks of care and support. The inauguration ceremony was simple but significant. At the improvised podium, Richard observed the audience full of familiar faces and new allies. Sophie, with her recorder always at hand, captured each moment. Helen, alongside Beatrice's parents, held a portrait of her daughter, whose smile seemed more luminous than ever. "This center is born from a story of pain," Richard began his speech, "but transforms into a beacon of hope. Each person here present is part of this transformation. Each one of you is a brick in this construction of dignity and love." The words were interrupted by a commotion at the entrance. A group of women was arriving, all former residents of the shelter, some with their babies, others still pregnant. They had seen the news and came to offer their testimonies, seek help, be part of the change. "Look," Sophie whispered, moved. "How a revealed truth can free so many people." Helen quickly organized the team to welcome the newcomers. Maya, with her personal experience, naturally became a bridge of connection and understanding. In the middle of the afternoon, while the center pulsed with its first batch of care, Richard received a call from the medical board. His license had been officially revalidated. Dr. Richard Morgan was back in action, no longer carrying the weight of guilt, but the responsibility of care. "You know what's most beautiful in all this?" Dr. Albert commented, observing the movement at the center. "How each person here found their own healing by helping others heal." Sophie, who was finishing updating her article with the latest developments, smiled. "It's as if each individual story were a chapter of a larger book, a narrative of collective redemption. In the center's garden, specially designed to be a space of peace and reflection, Helen gathered the main group at the end of the day. Marina played with a colorful mobile, her laughter echoing like background music. Beatrice always said that dreams don't end, they just transform, she shared, looking at her daughter's portrait. I think I finally understand what she meant. Richard observed the group that fate had brought together in such an unlikely way. Sophie, the journalist who sought justice. Maya, the young mother who found her strength. Helen, who transformed pain into purpose. Dr. Albert, the mentor who never gave up. Claire, who had the courage to reveal the truth. And Marina, the small miracle that catalyzed all this transformation. That special morning, Richard arrived earlier than usual. He stopped in front of the large mural in the reception area, where photos told the story of the place. In the center, Beatrice's image smiled, surrounded by portraits of babies born there, smiling mothers, reunited families. Among them, a photo from that day in the restaurant when everything began. I still get emotional looking at this mural, Maya's voice surprised him. She approached with Marina, now a smart and smiling baby, almost a year old. Each photo tells a story of overcoming, Richard replied, watching Marina play with his lab coat. And to think that you were our first story. The center was buzzing with activity. In the prenatal care wing, Dr. Albert was guiding a group of residents. The newly approved obstetrics residency program attracted young doctors from across the country. Medicine is not just about procedures, he explained to the students. It's about listening, caring, presence. In the group room, Helen was leading a conversation circle with pregnant women. Among them was Anna, now in her final days of pregnancy, her transformation visible not only in her body, but mainly in her confident and serene look. When I arrived here, she shared with the group, I was terrified, without hope. Today, I know my baby will be born in an environment of love and respect. Sophie, who continued to follow the center's development closely, was working on her new book. From Fear to Hope, the revolution in maternal care promised to tell not only the center's story, but of all the lives transformed by it. You know what impresses me most? She commented to Claire during a coffee break. How each person who arrives here ends up becoming part of something bigger. It's like a chain of love that never stops growing. In the therapeutic garden, Maya was guiding a group of young mothers on relaxation and breastfeeding techniques. Her personal story of overcoming had made her a natural counselor, especially for women who, like her, had escaped from vulnerable situations. Each of you carries a strength that you may not yet know, she said, while Marina played with other children on the mat. Sometimes we just need an extended hand to discover that strength. In the afternoon, a special meeting took place in the auditorium. Representatives from the Department of Health came to learn about the center's work, interested in transforming it into public policy. What you've built here, the health secretary commented, is more than a medical center. It's a model of how healthcare can transform realities. Richard, presenting the results of the first months, felt completely at peace with his rediscovered vocation. The numbers were impressive. 0 serious complications, humanized birth rates well above the national average, and most importantly, dozens of stories of transformed lives. Our differential, he explained to the audience, is not just in the structure or protocols. It's in the story that each person here carries, in the personal experience that makes us deeply understand the importance of humanized care. Helen, who was attending the presentation, couldn't contain her tears of emotion. Beside her, Beatrice's parents held hands, their faces reflecting a mixture of longing and fulfillment. Our daughter always said that love has the power to transform pain into purpose, Beatrice's mother commented softly. Looking at all this, I finally understand what she meant. At the end of that day, as the sun set painting the sky in pinkish tones, the group gathered in the garden for a moment of intimate celebration. Marina, who was beginning to take her first steps, walked awkwardly among the adults, drawing smiles from everyone. It's incredible to think, Dr. Albert reflected, how a story that began with so much pain could generate so much love. Sophie, who was making notes in her notebook, raised her eyes with a smile. Perhaps that's the real miracle, love's capacity to transform stories, to heal wounds, to create new beginnings. Marina's first birthday coincided with a particularly significant morning at the Beatrice Sanders Shelter Center. The little one, dressed in a delicate blue dress, was the center of attention at the party organized by the staff. Her illuminated smile and her still unsure little steps perfectly symbolized the transformation journey that everyone had traveled. 1 year, Maya whispered, watching her daughter play with other children. It seems like just yesterday I entered that restaurant in desperation. Richard, who was organizing the last details of the double celebration, Marina's birthday and 1 year of the center, smiled as he heard the comment. And look how much love was born from that moment of desperation. The center had transformed into a national reference in humanized care. The walls, once empty, now displayed a gallery of success stories. Photographs of babies born there, emotional testimonials from mothers, newspaper clippings telling stories of overcoming, each image a testament to the power of compassion and care. Sophie, who had just returned from a series of lectures about her now best-selling book, was meeting with her team for a new project, a documentary about the transformation of the maternal care system in the country. It's not just about the center, she explained while adjusting her camera. It's about how a personal story of pain can trigger a revolution of love. Helen, who now coordinated a national network of shelter centers inspired by the model created there, smiled as she saw the courtyard full of life. Pregnant women participated. In yoga classes, children played in the therapeutic playground. Entire families found there a space of healing and renewal. Beatrice would be so proud, she commented, adjusting her daughter's portrait that occupied a place of honor at the reception. Her dream grew beyond any expectation. Dr. Albert, now coordinator of the center's medical residency program, observed his students with paternal pride. Each new doctor trained here carries not only technical knowledge, but mainly the understanding of the transformative power of humanized care. Marina's party gathered everyone who had been part of that incredible journey. Anna, with her 3-month-old baby in her arms, shared experiences with other mothers. Claire, who remained dedicated to the center, coordinated. A growing team of nurses specialized in maternal infant care. At the moment of the birthday song, Richard asked to speak. His emotional speech captured the essence of what everyone felt. A year ago in this same place, we inaugurated more than a medical center. We inaugurated a space where pain transforms into hope, where fear transforms into strength, where sad stories gain new happy endings. Marina, our little warrior, represents all the lives that were and will continue to be transformed here. Her first year of life is also the first year of a new era in maternal care in our country. Maya, with tears in her eyes, completed. And each new mother who arrives here finds not just medical care but a family, a place where she can be truly welcomed and understood. Sophie, who was recording everything, realized she was facing the perfect ending for her documentary. Sometimes, she reflected, the most powerful stories are those that show us how love can flourish even in the most unlikely places. At Tay, the end of the party, as the sun set on the horizon, the group gathered for a special photo. Marina, in Maya's lap, smiled next to Richard. Helen, Dr. Albert, Claire, Sophie, and all the others who had been part of that incredible journey positioned themselves around them. In the background, Beatrice's portrait seemed to smile, blessing that moment. "You know," Richard commented, looking at the group, "they say there are no coincidences, only predestined encounters. Each person here had a wound to heal, a mission to fulfill. The universe just brought us together at the right moment. And look what we built together," Sophie completed, lowering her camera, "a story that will continue to inspire and transform lives for generations." Marina, as if understanding the importance of the moment, let out one of her contagious laughs, filling the environment with joy. It was the purest sound of hope, of love, of life, following its natural course of healing and renewal. And so, under the orange sky of that special evening, the Beatrice Sanders Shelter Center continued its mission of transforming stories of pain into narratives of love and overcoming, proving that when care is offered with true compassion, there is no limit to the transformative power of love.